Tara Mitchell entered the designer store with a mission to gather intel on a dangerous financier. But before she could complete her undercover operation, a uniformed officer approached her, eyes filled with suspicion. Despite flashing her FBI badge, she soon found herself handcuffed, arrested, and humiliated in front of a crowd because Officer Greg Thomas refused to believe a black woman could be a federal agent. Little did he know, the storm he had just unleashed would change his life and hers forever. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The warm sunlight filtered through the large windows of the upscale boutique, casting a glow on the polished marble floors and racks of designer clothing. The store was buzzing with activity. Stylish customers chatting with sales associates, admiring glittering displays, and making purchases that seemed effortless. Amid the wealth and glamour stood Special Agent Tara Mitchell, her casual attire making her almost invisible among the luxury shoppers. But that was the point. Tara was undercover, and in this world of high-end fashion and exclusivity, she needed to blend in. Tara's assignment wasn't about fashion or shopping. She was there to observe a high-profile financier, a man suspected of laundering millions through his extravagant lifestyle. The FBI had been watching him for months, but today, Tara was tasked with gathering critical intelligence without raising suspicion. She wasn't dressed like a typical customer. No designer handbag, no jewelry dripping with diamonds, just simple jeans, a blouse, and an air of quiet confidence. Still, her presence didn't go unnoticed. The store employees had been eyeing her since she walked in. Tara could feel their gazes, subtle but sharp, cutting through her like a blade. She tried to ignore it, staying focused on the task at hand, but the familiar weight of judgment pressed down on her. It wasn't the first time she'd felt out of place in spaces like this. Being a black woman, even with an FBI badge tucked discreetly in her jacket, didn't shield her from the quiet assumptions people made about her. She saw it in the way the sales associates bypassed her to attend to other customers, and how security glanced her way every few minutes. Taking a deep breath, Tara moved through the store, scanning the room for her target. The financier hadn't arrived yet, and she needed to find a discreet spot to observe without drawing attention. Near the back of the store, she found a quiet corner behind a display of handbags. From here, she could watch the entrance and the surrounding area while blending into the background. Her phone buzzed with a text from her partner, Agent Marcus Ray. He was stationed in a van nearby, monitoring the financier's movements through surveillance. "He's on his way," the message read. Tara's heart quickened, not from nerves, but from the surge of adrenaline that came with the job. This was her chance to gather crucial information, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. As she waited, her thoughts wandered. She had been with the FBI for almost 10 years, working her way up through dedication, intelligence, and grit. But even with all her accomplishments, moments like these, when the world looked at her and saw only her skin color, reminded her of how far society still had to go. She shook off the thoughts, refocusing on the mission. Today wasn't about her, it was about justice. Suddenly, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The door opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. It was him, the financier. Tara straightened, her eyes narrowing as she observed his every move. He greeted a sales associate, flashing a charming smile, and began browsing the store as if he didn't have a care in the world. But Tara knew better. Beneath that polished exterior was a man who had made millions through illegal means, and she was determined to bring him down. As she reached for her phone to notify Marcus, something unexpected happened. A uniformed police officer entered the store, his eyes scanning the room. Tara's heart sank. She hadn't called for backup, and this officer wasn't part of her team. He looked out of place in the luxurious setting, his uniform stark against the backdrop of wealth and opulence. The officer, Greg Thomas, moved with purpose, his gaze landing on Tara almost immediately. She stiffened, sensing trouble. Thomas was the kind of cop she'd encountered too many times in her life, quick to judge, quick to act without understanding the situation. He approached her with a look of disdain, as if her very presence in the store offended him. "Ma'am," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Tara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me? We've had a report of a suspicious individual in the store, and you matched the description," Thomas said, his eyes narrowing as he took in her casual attire. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Tara felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. She wasn't just any shopper. She was on official business, working a case. But she knew better than to escalate the situation. Keeping her voice calm, she said, "Officer, I'm Special Agent Tara Mitchell with the FBI. I'm on an investigation here. If you'd like to verify my credentials." Thomas cut her off, his eyes flicking to the badge she discreetly showed him. "That's a nice trick," he said with a smirk. "But I'm not buying it. You need to leave now, or I'll have to take you in." Tara's heart pounded, not out of fear, but frustration. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but never while on duty, never while trying to conduct a critical operation. She looked around the store, noticing the stares of customers and staff, some whispering, some openly watching the scene unfold. This was quickly spiraling out of control, and her target was still in the store, oblivious to the unfolding drama. "Officer Thomas," Tara said firmly, "I suggest you contact your superior. I'm not leaving, and you're making a serious mistake." But Thomas wasn't listening. His mind was made up. In his eyes, Tara was just another black woman in a place she didn't belong, and he was determined to put her in her place. Without warning, Thomas reached for her arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Tara's heart sank as she realized the situation was about to get much worse. She had no choice but to comply for now, knowing that any resistance could lead to a scene she couldn't control. As Thomas pulled her toward the exit, the eyes of the store followed her, judging, assuming, and confirming their worst biases. Her mission was in jeopardy, but worse than that, so was her dignity. Tara's breath caught in her throat as Officer Greg Thomas tightened his grip on her arm. His fingers dug into her skin with an authority that felt far too familiar, a power that had little to do with upholding the law and everything to do with the assumption of superiority. She forced herself to stay calm, drawing on her years of FBI training, but underneath that calm, anger simmered just below the surface. Not just anger at this officer, but at the situation she found herself in yet again. Judged, assumed guilty, targeted. They were only steps away from the store's grand entrance now. The eyes of the wealthy shoppers and store employees still followed them, some faces filled with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. No one had stepped in to question Officer Thomas's actions. No one had even considered that he might be making a mistake. Tara caught the sound of hushed whispers as she was led past. "She probably tried to steal something," a woman murmured under her breath, clutching her designer purse closer. "She doesn't belong here, does she?" another customer muttered, their voice carrying an air of superiority. Tara's jaw tightened. It wasn't just about the humiliation. She could feel her mission slipping through her fingers, the opportunity to gather critical intelligence disappearing as Officer Thomas dragged her closer to the exit. Her target, the financier, was still inside, casually browsing the racks of clothing, oblivious to the scene unfolding just a few feet away. She glanced back once more, hoping for some sign that her mission wasn't completely falling apart. But the look on Officer Thomas's face made it clear. He was convinced that she was just another criminal, another black woman caught where she wasn't supposed to be. "Officer, this is a mistake," Tara said again, trying to keep her voice level. "I've shown you my credentials. I'm an FBI agent on official business. You need to call your supervisor right now." Thomas's grip tightened as he pushed her toward the door. "Lady, I don't care what you're claiming. I don't know what kind of fake badge you're waving around, but you're coming with me." His voice dripped with condescension. Tara's temper flared, but she forced herself to remain calm. A public confrontation would only make things worse. She was no stranger to this, having spent years navigating spaces where people questioned her authority, undermined her qualifications, or made assumptions about her competence. But this was different. This wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Outside the store, the cool air hit her face as they stepped onto the street. A police car sat parked at the curb, its lights flashing, drawing even more attention to the scene. Bystanders gathered, some filming with their phones, while others stood with arms crossed, watching with varying degrees of interest and apathy. Tara couldn't help but think how easy it was for them to stand by, to watch, to judge. They didn't know who she was or what she was doing there, and none of them cared enough to ask. "Officer Thomas, stop," she demanded, pulling back against his grip. "I'm not resisting, but I'm telling you, this is wrong. Call your captain. Now." Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of authority that came from her years in the FBI. She knew she had to maintain her composure, but the thought of this officer making such a critical mistake burned in her chest. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with uncertainty before hardening again. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he warned, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. And that was the final straw. Tara moved quickly, pulling her arm free from his grasp, but she kept her movements controlled. "You're about to arrest a federal agent," she said, her voice low but firm. "You don't want to do this." But Thomas had already decided how this would end. Before she could finish speaking, he grabbed her arm again and twisted it behind her back. Tara winced as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped onto her wrists, the familiar sound filling her ears like a cruel echo of countless other incidents where people in her position had been stripped of their dignity. "You have the right to remain silent," Thomas began, his voice mechanical as he recited the Miranda rights. Tara's mind raced. She wasn't just being humiliated. This was a full-blown arrest. A crowd had gathered now, their eyes wide, phones held high to record every second. Some faces were filled with smug satisfaction, while others seemed genuinely confused by the scene. But no one spoke up in her defense. Not one person had stepped forward to question why this officer had targeted her. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Tara's body tensed. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but not from fear. No, it was the deep frustration, the profound sense of injustice that was flooding her veins now. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been wrongly accused, every individual who had been profiled and judged before they had a chance to speak for themselves. "You have no idea what you're doing," Tara said through gritted teeth as Thomas guided her toward the police car. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Thomas scoffed, clearly not taking her words seriously. He opened the door of the police car and roughly pushed her inside, the weight of her handcuffs making her movements awkward and uncomfortable. Tara sat in silence for a moment, staring out of the car window at the crowd still gathered outside the boutique. She could see the disbelief in some of their eyes, the satisfaction in others, but none of them knew the truth. As the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in the back seat of the squad car, Tara took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid, far from it. She was furious. She could feel the heat of that anger rising in her chest, the years of quiet endurance bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about an arrest gone wrong. This was about something much deeper, something far more dangerous than any criminal she'd ever taken down. Because what Officer Thomas didn't know, what he refused to see, was that she wasn't the problem. His prejudice was. And now, with the weight of those handcuffs pressing into her wrists, Tara knew one thing for sure. Karma was coming for him. He just didn't realize it yet. The car's engine hummed softly as Officer Greg Thomas drove Tara to the station, his smug expression unwavering. Tara sat silently in the back seat, her wrists still bound by the cold, unforgiving metal of the handcuffs. She felt a familiar, heavy weight in her chest, but she knew better than to let anger take control. Her training had taught her to remain calm in the face of adversity, yet the frustration bubbling beneath the surface was undeniable. How had it come to this? She had been moments away from making progress on her investigation, but now she was sitting in the back of a police car, her professional credibility dismissed by an officer who couldn't look past his assumptions. Through the window, Tara saw the police station growing closer, a stark, gray building that stood in contrast to the upscale boutique where the incident had begun. The voices of those luxury shoppers, those silent bystanders who had chosen to judge rather than intervene, echoed in her head. They had all assumed the worst. Not one person had questioned why an officer would so abruptly arrest a black woman in their midst. Not one person had offered her the benefit of the doubt. Her phone buzzed again, a muted vibration in her jacket pocket that she couldn't reach. Tara knew it was likely her partner, Agent Marcus Ray, trying to check in. She had missed their scheduled updates, and Marcus would be worried. He was always vigilant, and by now, he'd know something was wrong. If she knew Marcus, he was already looking for her, piecing together the story of her disappearance. As the car pulled to a stop in the station's back lot, Thomas got out, walking around to open her door. He grabbed her arm and led her into the building, still gripping her with far more force than necessary. It was a move not just of control, but of assertion, an unnecessary display of power. Tara kept her head held high as they entered the station, determined not to let the situation break her composure. The precinct was buzzing with the usual sounds of officers going about their daily duties, phones ringing, paperwork shuffling, conversations overlapping. Tara could feel the stares as she was led through the station, handcuffed and escorted like a common criminal. Some officers glanced curiously in her direction, while others didn't seem to care, too wrapped up in their own routines to notice what was unfolding in front of them. At the booking desk, a clerk with tired eyes looked up, blinking as he took in the scene before him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he prepared to process her. "Name?" the clerk asked, his voice flat and indifferent. Before Officer Thomas could respond, Tara spoke clearly and firmly. "Special Agent Tara Mitchell, FBI." The clerk's fingers paused in midair, and he glanced up at Thomas, a look of mild confusion crossing his face. "FBI?" the clerk repeated, doubt creeping into his voice. Thomas let out a dismissive laugh. "She's not FBI," he said confidently. "Caught her acting suspicious in a luxury store. Flashed what I'm sure is a fake badge. We'll verify it later." Tara's jaw tightened. She was trying to maintain her composure, but the weight of the injustice pressed on her with every passing second. She turned to the clerk, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'm on an active investigation. You're making a serious mistake, and I suggest you contact your superior immediately." The clerk hesitated, glancing between Thomas and Tara, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, it seemed like the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in for some of the officers nearby. The room grew quieter as more people started paying attention to the unfolding drama. Whispers spread through the station, and soon the murmurs reached the ears of a senior officer, Sergeant Collins, a man with salt and pepper hair and a deep-set frown. He approached the desk, his sharp eyes flicking between Tara and Thomas, immediately sensing that something wasn't right. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Collins asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "She claims to be FBI," Thomas answered with a smirk, his confidence still intact. "But I found her in a high-end store acting suspicious. I'm pretty sure she's got a fake badge." The sergeant's frown deepened, and he turned his attention to Tara. His eyes briefly softened, though his expression remained serious. "Special agent, is it?" Tara nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, my badge and credentials are in my jacket pocket. I suggest you take a look." Sergeant Collins gestured to one of the younger officers nearby, who stepped forward hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He carefully reached into Tara's jacket, pulling out her FBI badge and ID. His eyes widened as he examined them before handing them over to the sergeant. Collins looked at the badge for a moment, his face darkening with realization. He turned to Thomas, his voice low and laced with frustration. "This is real. She's a federal agent." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were now on Thomas, who stood frozen, his face draining of color as the weight of his actions began to sink in. The smugness he had worn like armor melted away, replaced by the dawning realization of the catastrophic mistake he had made. Tara stood still, her wrists still bound by the cuffs, watching the scene unfold. A part of her felt a grim satisfaction as Thomas's arrogance crumbled in front of her, but another part of her felt deeply weary. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the broader issue of prejudice, of assumptions made without facts, of judgments based on nothing more than skin color. She had spent years facing situations like this, fighting to prove herself in a world that constantly underestimated her. Thomas stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize." Sergeant Collins didn't let him finish. "Unlock the cuffs," he ordered sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Thomas fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the handcuffs from Tara's wrists. As the cuffs fell away, Tara rubbed her wrists, the sting of the metal still fresh against her skin. She could feel the eyes of the entire station on her, the whispers growing louder as the reality of what had just happened spread. I thought, Thomas began, but Tara cut him off, her voice calm but firm. You didn't think, she said, her eyes boring into his. You made assumptions based on nothing but your own biases. You dismissed my credentials, my authority, and my word because you couldn't see past what you wanted to believe. And now you'll have to answer for it. Thomas stood speechless, his face a mixture of regret and disbelief. Sergeant Collins didn't give him a chance to respond further. You're suspended, effective immediately, he said coldly. We'll be launching an internal investigation into your conduct. Thomas's face went pale, and he nodded weakly, too stunned to argue. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the gravity of the situation set in. Tara, now free from the cuffs, straightened her jacket and took a deep breath. Her anger hadn't faded, but she knew she couldn't let it consume her. This was bigger than one man's mistake. It was about the systemic issue that ran far deeper. Just then, her phone buzzed again, and this time she was able to answer it. It was Marcus, his voice filled with concern. Tara, where are you? We've been trying to reach you. I'm at the precinct, she said, her voice steady but laced with the frustration she had held back for too long. I've had a little complication. Marcus cursed softly on the other end. I'm coming to get you. As she ended the call, Tara turned to Sergeant Collins, who was watching her with a mixture of respect and regret. I'll be filing a formal complaint, Tara said, her voice controlled but firm. Not just about today, but about the culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Collins nodded solemnly. Understood, Agent Mitchell. We'll cooperate fully. Tara gave a slight nod and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back at Thomas, who stood like a ghost, his career now hanging by a thread. The reality of his prejudice had come crashing down, and he would soon face the full consequences of his actions. Tara knew this was far from over. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and karma, as always, would find its way. The cold wind hit Tara's face as she stepped out of the precinct, the night sky stretching above her in a dark, unforgiving canvas. She had walked out with her head held high, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her shoulders. The incident wasn't just about her. It was about every time someone had been wrongfully judged, every silent moment of discrimination that went unchallenged. But now, the reckoning was coming, and it wasn't just for Officer Thomas. The entire system that allowed officers like him to act without consequence would be put under the spotlight. A familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Marcus Ray stepped out, his face tight with concern. His broad shoulders seemed to carry the same weight Tara felt, his dark eyes scanning her quickly as if to make sure she was unharmed. You okay? He asked, his voice low but filled with emotion as he opened the passenger door for her. Tara nodded, sliding into the car. I'm fine now. Let's just get out of here. Marcus didn't need more details yet. He had already gathered enough from her brief phone call, and as they pulled away from the precinct, the silence between them spoke volumes. He drove carefully, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Marcus was one of the few people who truly understood what Tara had been through. Not just tonight, but throughout her career and in life. They had both risen through the ranks of the FBI against the odds, overcoming the constant hurdles of prejudice and assumption. But that didn't make situations like tonight any easier. Tara stared out of the window, the city lights blurring as they passed. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs, a physical reminder of the humiliation she had endured. Yet beneath the pain, there was something else. Resolve. The image of Officer Thomas's face, twisted in confusion and panic, as he realized what he had done, played over and over in her mind. It wasn't about him as an individual, though. He was just a symptom of a larger disease. After a few minutes, Marcus finally spoke. They're going to investigate him, right? They suspended him on the spot, Tara replied. Sergeant Collins is launching an internal investigation, but we both know that's only the beginning. I'm filing a formal complaint with the FBI, too. They need to know what went down. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. Good. This has to stop. It's not just about him, it's about everyone who thinks they can get away with this kind of thing. If this doesn't send a message, I don't know what will. Tara knew he was right. She had seen it too many times, officers who acted out of bias, who allowed their personal prejudices to override their duty to serve and protect. And every time it happened, it reinforced the distrust that so many communities had in law enforcement. It wasn't just about one mistake, it was about an entire system that failed to hold people accountable when they abused their power. The car pulled up outside Tara's apartment, and she turned to Marcus. "Thanks for picking me up." "You know I always have your back," he said, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "You want me to come up?" Tara shook her head. "I'll be fine. I just need some time to process." Marcus hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Call me if you need anything. And don't forget, we're in this together." Tara smiled faintly, appreciating his support. As she climbed out of the car and headed up to her apartment, the events of the night began to settle more deeply in her mind. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a battle in a much larger war, a war against prejudice, bias, and systemic inequality. Inside her apartment, Tara sank onto her couch, exhaling deeply. The quiet hum of the city outside her window was a stark contrast to the chaos of the precinct. She closed her eyes, replaying everything that had happened, feeling the sting of the cuffs, the humiliation of being paraded in front of the store's customers, the disbelief on Officer Thomas's face when he realized she was a federal agent. But there was something else too, something she had learned over the years in this job. There were always consequences. Karma didn't always come quickly, but it came nonetheless. And tonight, she had seen the first cracks in Thomas's facade. The next morning, Tara sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters, her formal complaint already written and ready to be filed. Across from her sat Agent Marcus Ray and their supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Linda Cole, a woman known for her no-nonsense attitude and fierce commitment to justice. Cole's sharp blue eyes scanned the complaint, her expression unreadable as she read through the details. When she finished, she set the papers down, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is serious," Cole said, her voice low but firm. "The department is already dealing with public scrutiny over similar incidents. If this goes public, it could cause a firestorm." Tara met her gaze without flinching. "It should go public. This isn't just about me. It's about a culture of discrimination that's gone unchecked for too long. We have to be part of the solution, not the problem." Cole leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "And you're willing to be the face of this? Because make no mistake, this is going to be a high-profile case if the media gets hold of it. There's no going back once that happens." Tara didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." Marcus, sitting next to her, nodded in agreement. "We've seen this kind of thing too many times. We can't just sweep it under the rug. Not anymore." Cole was silent for a moment, considering their words. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll support you on this. But understand, it's going to get messy. The police department will try to protect their own, and the media will dig into everything." Tara knew what she was getting into, but she had made up her mind. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been in her position, judged and humiliated simply for existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. Later that day, as Tara was preparing to leave the office, she received a call from her lawyer. The footage of her arrest had been leaked to the public. Someone in the store had recorded the entire incident, and it was now circulating online. The video showed Officer Thomas aggressively cuffing her, despite her calm demeanor and repeated explanations that she was an FBI agent. The footage was damning. Tara braced herself for the inevitable media frenzy. News outlets had already picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with reactions. Some people were outraged by the clear display of racial profiling, while others, predictably, tried to justify the officer's actions, claiming he was just doing his job. But Tara knew the truth, and now the world was seeing it too. The police department was forced to issue a statement that evening, confirming that Officer Thomas had been suspended pending an investigation. But the damage was done. The video had sparked a firestorm of controversy, and the public was demanding answers. As the days passed, Tara watched as the conversation around her case grew louder. Protests erupted outside the police station, and activists rallied around her story, using it as a symbol of the broader fight against systemic racism in law enforcement. Tara found herself thrust into the spotlight, her name becoming synonymous with the movement for justice. It was exhausting, but Tara didn't back down. She had spent her entire life fighting for her place in the world, and she wasn't about to stop now. One afternoon, weeks later, Tara received a notification on her phone. The internal investigation into Officer Thomas had been completed. He had been formally terminated from the force, and his name was added to the growing list of officers who had been held accountable for their actions in the wake of public scrutiny. Tara felt a sense of closure, but she knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more Thomases in the world, more moments of injustice to confront. But for now, she had made a difference. She had stood her ground, and karma had done the rest. Weeks had passed since the viral video of Tara's wrongful arrest took over the media. The uproar it caused had reached far beyond the city. National news outlets picked up the story, and the video played on every major network, highlighting the systemic racial bias that had led to such a gross misuse of authority. Tara had become a reluctant symbol of a fight she had always been part of, but never sought to lead so publicly. Despite her reluctance to be in the spotlight, she understood the significance of her role now. The world was watching. Tara stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her suit jacket before leaving for an important speaking event. She had been invited to address a large audience at a conference on police reform and racial bias in law enforcement. Though the focus had shifted somewhat from her personal experience to the broader issues of systemic racism, she knew that her story had become a rallying cry. There was no turning back. She wasn't just an FBI agent anymore. She was a face, a voice, for something much larger. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a text from Marcus. "You ready? Big day." Tara smiled faintly. Marcus had been by her side through it all, supporting her as the pressure mounted. She texted back quickly, "Yeah, let's do this." The conference hall was packed when Tara and Marcus arrived. Journalists were scattered throughout the audience, eager to capture sound bites and moments that would feed the ongoing media frenzy. Activists, law enforcement officials, and community leaders filled the seats, all looking to Tara to offer some insight, some solution to the deep-rooted problems they were fighting against. Tara felt a slight knot in her stomach as she made her way to the stage. She wasn't nervous about speaking in public. Her FBI training had prepared her for situations far more daunting than this. But today was different. Today wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about emotion, about shared pain, about the long, slow road toward real change. She wasn't just speaking as a professional today. She was speaking as a human being who had lived the experience of being wrongly judged, humiliated, and profiled. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. The weight of the moment was palpable. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers. But she could feel their collective energy, their desire for change, and it gave her strength. She cleared her throat, and her voice was steady as she began. "I didn't expect to be standing here today, speaking to all of you about something so personal. But the events of the past few weeks have forced me to confront not only what happened to me, but what's been happening for far too long, to too many people." The room was silent as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. Tara recounted her arrest briefly, but with enough detail to remind the audience of the injustice. She explained how, despite her position as a federal agent, she had been reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of Officer Thomas, a criminal simply because of her skin color. Her voice didn't waver as she described the frustration, the humiliation, and the anger that had burned inside her as she was dragged out of that luxury store in handcuffs. "But this isn't just about me," Tara continued, her voice growing stronger. "This is about the millions of people who have experienced the same thing, who have been judged and punished based on nothing more than a stereotype. This is about the mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters who live in fear every time they walk down the street, knowing that at any moment, someone with a badge could decide they don't belong, that they're a threat, and act on that bias." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We have a responsibility, all of us, to confront this system, to hold it accountable. It's not enough to just suspend officers after they've done the damage. We have to prevent this from happening in the first place. We have to dismantle the prejudices that allow these things to happen. There was a ripple of applause. But Tara wasn't finished. She leaned into the microphone, her voice soft but filled with conviction. And it starts with accountability. It starts with admitting that the problem exists. Only then can we begin to heal. The applause grew louder, and Tara took a step back from the podium, giving the audience a moment to process her words. She wasn't here for the praise or the accolades. She was here because there was still work to be done, and it was bigger than her. Bigger than Officer Thomas, bigger than any one person. As the conference wound down, Tara and Marcus stood outside the hall, watching as attendees left, some of them stopping to thank her for her words. She offered them polite smiles, but her mind was elsewhere, still turning over the events of the past few weeks. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Exhausted," Tara admitted, exhaling a long breath. "But also, ready. We're starting something real here, Marcus. It's not just about the protests or the media coverage. People are listening. They're paying attention." Marcus nodded. "They are. And you're right. We've started something. But we have to keep pushing. We can't let them forget." Tara gave him a faint smile. "I know. And I'm not going to let them forget." Just then, Tara noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Officer Greg Thomas, looking different than the last time she had seen him. He was no longer in uniform, his posture less rigid, and there was a look of uncertainty in his eyes. Tara felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, but also something else. She couldn't deny that Thomas had been a catalyst for this movement, but seeing him now, out of the public eye, stripped of his badge and authority, he looked small, human. He stopped a few feet away from her, hesitant. "Agent Mitchell," he said, his voice subdued. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Tara regarded him for a moment, studying his face. She could see the guilt weighing on him, the remorse that had taken root since the moment he realized who she was and what he had done. But forgiveness was not something she was ready to offer. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage you caused," Tara said, her tone measured. "Not just to me, but to every person you've ever judged unfairly." Thomas looked down at his feet, shame filling his features. "I know. I messed up. I let my own prejudices blind me, and He stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I want to do better. I want to learn." Tara's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't relent. Doing better doesn't just mean saying the right things. It means putting in the work, changing the way you see the world, and that's not something you do in a day. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "I know. I'm going to try. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just needed to say it." Tara didn't offer him the absolution he sought, but she did nod, a small acknowledgement that perhaps he could begin the process of change. Maybe. Without another word, Thomas turned and walked away, leaving Tara standing there, Marcus by her side. There was a long silence between them before Marcus finally spoke. "You think he's serious?" Tara shrugged. "I don't know. People like him have a long way to go before they understand the full impact of what they've done. But I hope, for his sake, that he's serious." Marcus nodded. "What now?" Tara looked out at the horizon, the weight of everything she had been through settling around her but not crushing her. She had endured humiliation, fought back against a system stacked against her, and had become a voice for change. But the work wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Now," Tara said, a determined edge in her voice, "we keep fighting." And with that, Tara turned and walked forward, her steps steady, her resolve unshaken, knowing that the battle for justice was far from over, but it was one she was ready to face, no matter how long it took. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.